The line of cars moved at a slow, deliberate pace, headlights glowing faintly against the midday sun as they approached the iron gates of the community. The mourners inside each vehicle sat in heavy silence, their eyes fixed on the road ahead, their minds elsewhere on the life they were about to honor, on the final goodbyes they weren't ready to say. At the front of the procession, a hearse rolled with solemn dignity, draped in the weight of sorrow. But before the first vehicle could cross the threshold into the neighborhood, a figure stepped forward, halting the movement with a single raised hand. She was the gatekeeper of the HOA, a woman in a crisp navy blue security uniform, her expression sharp, her clipboard clutched tightly under one arm. Her stance carried the confidence of someone used to enforcing rules without compromise. She waved the procession to a stop, her voice clear and commanding. "Hold it right there. No one goes through until I see proper clearance." The driver of the hearse cracked his window, confusion etched on his face. "This is a funeral procession," he said softly, as though the sight of the cars, the black attire, the flowers balanced carefully in hands, didn't already speak for itself. But the officer's eyes were fixed on her paperwork, unmoved by grief or circumstance. "Doesn't matter. There's no record of an approved event. HOA policy requires at least 72 hours notice for large gatherings. Without that, I can't let you in." She tapped the clipboard for emphasis, as if the weight of ink on paper could justify halting the grieving. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the line of cars. Windows rolled down as voices rose, pleas, protests, questions. "This is for my father," a woman's voice broke from one of the vehicles, the tremor in her words carrying more weight than any policy could. Yet the officer's face remained impassive, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination. To her, the rules were absolute, a shield she clung to with unwavering grip. The gate loomed just beyond her shoulder, tall and cold, a barrier meant to protect the community, but now transformed into an obstacle between mourning hearts and their last act of respect. Inside the cars, frustration mingled with sorrow, turning the air heavy with emotion. The procession had expected silence, prayers, and final words of farewell, but instead they were met with resistance, stopped at the threshold by someone who could not see the weight of the moment through the narrow lens of her rulebook. The minutes dragged on, and what should have been a smooth, solemn passage turned into a scene of tension and disbelief. The mourners sat trapped in their cars, dressed in black, clutching tissues, flowers, and memories they had hoped to honor in peace. Instead, they were forced into a standstill, their grief colliding with an obstacle they never imagined. One by one, car doors opened and people began stepping out, their faces weary and eyes swollen from tears. The sun glared down on them, heat rising from the pavement, amplifying the frustration that mingled with their sorrow. A man in his 60s, leaning heavily on a cane, walked slowly toward the officer, his voice breaking with quiet desperation. "Please, this is my brother's funeral. He lived here. His family lives here. We're just trying to say goodbye." His words carried the weight of both grief and dignity, but the officer only shifted her stance, her arms folding firmly across her chest. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said flatly, "but rules are rules. Without written authorization from the HOA, I cannot permit entry. You'll have to turn around and reschedule." Reschedule. The word struck the group like a cruel joke. A funeral could not be postponed, like a birthday party or a barbecue. Gasps and murmurs of outrage rippled through the gathering mourners. A young woman holding a bouquet of lily pressed them tightly to her chest, tears spilling over as she whispered, "How can you reschedule a final goodbye?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, except by the officer's cold silence. Line of cars stretched back onto the road, blocking traffic. while horns honked impatiently from strangers unaware of the grief unfolding. Some mourners began arguing, their voices rising, pleading for compassion, reminding the officer of the humanity behind the moment. But she remained unmoved, as if every word bounced harmlessly off the shield of her authority. The atmosphere grew heavier by the second, grief turning to anger, sorrow mixing with indignation. The mourners had prepared themselves for the weight of loss, but not for a battle at a gate guarded by indifference. The gate stood tall and unyielding, the officer unflinching, and the mourners caught between pain and powerlessness. What was meant to be a sacred procession had become a public standoff, and behind every desperate plea was the aching truth. Respect for the dead was being denied in the name of policy. The frustration reached a breaking point. As the officer doubled down, her voice growing sharper with every protest. "I said no one goes through without clearance. If you keep blocking this road, I'll have to call for backup." The mourners stared at her in disbelief. Backup for a funeral procession? The sheer absurdity of the threat made the grief sting even more. Tension hung thick in the air, heavy enough to choke, and yet the gate remained closed. The officer's clipboard clutched like a badge of power. Then, quietly, one of the back doors in the line of cars opened. A man stepped out slowly, his presence instantly commanding attention. He was dressed in a dark suit, sharp but simple, his movements calm and deliberate. The crowd fell silent as he approached, the hush carrying through the line of vehicles. His polished shoes tapped against the asphalt in measured rhythm, and though he spoke no word at first, the look in his eyes carried authority far greater than the officer's posture of defiance. When he reached the front of the procession, the officer straightened, narrowing her eyes. "Sir, you need to return to your vehicle." "I've already explained." Her words faltered when he drew a small leather wallet from his pocket and flipped it open. A glint of metal caught the sunlight, and the unmistakable seal of the state shone back at her. Gasps escaped from the mourners, whispers rippling through the crowd. "I am a representative of the state," the man said evenly, his voice calm but resolute, each word echoing with controlled power. "And this procession will continue without further interference." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the weight of law, a force the officer's rulebook could never match. The officer's confident stance wavered. She blinked at the badge, her lips parting but no words escaping. Her clipboard trembled slightly in her grip as the realization struck she had not just been standing against a grieving family, but against the authority of the state itself. The mourners, once powerless, now stood taller, their grief momentarily lifted by a wave of vindication. For the first time since they'd arrived, the balance of power had shifted. The officer who had seemed immovable only moments before now looked smaller, cornered not by anger, but by the truth of her overreach. The state had spoken, and the gatekeeper was no longer in control. A heavy silence followed the man's declaration, broken only by the low hum of idling engines and the faint rustle of flowers held by trembling hands. The officer stood frozen, her authority crumbling before the weight of the badge that gleamed just inches from her face. Her once firm stance softened, shoulders dropping as the defiance drained from her eyes. For the first time, she looked less like a figure of control and more like someone who had just realized the enormity of her mistake. The man didn't raise his voice, yet his words carried like thunder. No policy, no gate, and no clipboard holds more power than the dignity of these mourners or the laws of this state. Open the gate now. His tone was steady, calm, but it left no room for argument. The officer hesitated, her gaze flickering between the mourners and the badge, before fumbling with the keypad on the gate's control box. With a mechanical groan, the iron barriers began to slide open, the screech of metal giving way to the sound of freedom. The mourners watched in silence as the gate slowly revealed the road beyond. Some bowed their heads, others clutched the hands of loved ones, but all felt the weight of relief mingled with the sadness that had brought them here. One by one, they began returning to their vehicles, their movements slow and deliberate, as if still processing the surreal clash that had nearly overshadowed their day of remembrance. As the hearse moved forward, its black frame catching the sunlight, the official stepped aside with quiet respect, ensuring the procession passed undisturbed. His eyes lingered on the officer, who now stood stiff and pale, clipboard hanging limply at her side. She avoided his gaze, shame settling over her like a shadow. The authority she had wielded so tightly minutes before seemed to vanish into the dust stirred by the departing cars. The vehicles rolled through in solemn unity, their headlights glowing once more, a quiet reminder of the journey they were meant to complete. No cheers erupted, no applause marked the moment, only the quiet dignity of a procession restored. For the mourners, it was a victory not of triumph, but of respect reclaimed. For the officer, it was a lesson written not in ink on her clipboard, but in the hearts of those she had wronged. At that gate, compassion had prevailed over rigid rules, and the authority of the state had ensured that love and respect would not be stopped by a lock and key.